The First World War was not just a military conflict. It was a political, economic, and social phenomenon that profoundly transformed the world in the early 20th century. As we expand our analysis, it is essential to explore how internal and external factors influenced the decisions of the powers to enter the war and how these factors shaped events during and after the conflict. Although the initial objectives were defined in terms of territorial gains, economic hegemony, or strategic security, the war quickly revealed the complexity of international relations at the time and the limitations of the military strategies adopted by each country. This deeper analysis helps us understand the perceived futility of the conflict, which was widely recognized only after the end of the war, when the human and material costs became evident and the failure to establish a stable peace became clear. To begin with, it is important to highlight that the war was in many ways the result of a series of military alliances and an unbridled arms race. Alliances such as the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente, France, the United Kingdom, and Russia, were originally conceived as a means of deterring aggression from other states by creating a balance of power in Europe. However, these alliances ended up escalating the situation, turning a local crisis, such as the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, into a conflict of continental proportions. The logic of alliances implied that any confrontation between two nations would quickly draw other powers into the conflict, creating an escalatory dynamic that was difficult to contain. This interconnectedness of alliances is one of the factors that contributed to the rapid mobilization of troops and the outbreak of hostilities on several fronts. In addition to alliances, heightened nationalism played a crucial role in the outbreak of war. In Germany, nationalism was deeply rooted in a narrative of imperial pride and recent unification, while in France, revanchism was fueled by a desire for revenge for the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. The United Kingdom was not immune to nationalism either, manifested in a patriotic fervor that defended the empire over which the sun never set. In Russia, Panslavism helped justify the empire's involvement in the Balkans, while in Austria-Hungary, the attempt to maintain territorial integrity in the face of separatism among national minorities also had a strong nationalist basis. Nationalism, therefore, was not only a motivating force for the war, but also a factor that made it difficult to negotiate an early peace, as each nation was concerned about not losing prestige or influence on the international stage. Another important aspect is the arms race that preceded the conflict. Since the end of the 19th century, the European powers had been engaged in a continuous effort to expand their military arsenals, increasing not only the number of soldiers, but also their weapons production capacity. This included the development of new technologies, such as more effective machine guns, heavy artillery, and even chemical weapons, which would be used on a large scale during the war. The very construction of ever larger and more powerful naval fleets, particularly between Germany and the United Kingdom, exemplifies how the focus on military preparedness became a national priority. This milieu of militarism created a mindset of inevitable war, where powers were ready to act quickly, believing that they could achieve victory through their superior military might. Ironically, this race for military superiority ultimately contributed to the prolongation of the war, as each side believed that it was only a decisive offensive away from forcing the enemy to surrender. As the conflict unfolded, trench warfare became a symbol of the futility of confrontation. The stagnation on the front lines, especially on the Western Front, demonstrated how inadequate the military tactics of the time were to the new technological reality of warfare. While cavalry and infantry charges were common strategies early in the conflict, they soon proved ineffective in the face of the firepower of machine guns and artillery. This mismatch between strategy and technology resulted in battles of attrition, such as the Somme and Verdun, where territorial gains were minimal but human losses were catastrophic. The conditions in the trenches, mud, disease, lack of supplies, and the constant threat of bombing and gas attacks, contributed to a sense of futility among the soldiers. Many reported a sense of despair as their actions seemed to have little impact on the overall outcome of the war, which dragged on with no clear conclusion in sight. Meanwhile, the economic impact of the war was equally devastating. The economies of the powers involved were redirected to support the war effort, resulting in shortages of essential goods, inflation, and massive debt. Germany, for example, faced a naval blockade that limited access to food and raw materials, leading to widespread famine in many cities. The United Kingdom and France, in turn, contracted large debts with the United States to finance their operations, which impacted their economies in the post-war period. In addition, the need to maintain arms production led to rapid industrialization in some sectors, but also caused disruption in others, creating problems of economic readjustment at the end of the conflict. The economic deterioration resulting from the war was one of the factors that contributed to political and social instability in the post-war period, paving the way for the emergence of authoritarian regimes, such as Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy. Another important factor to be considered is the role of the colonies in the conflict. Although the major European powers were the central actors, the involvement of troops and resources from the colonies was crucial to the war effort. Soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and other parts of the British Empire, as well as French colonial troops from Algeria, Senegal, and Indochina, were mobilized in large numbers. For many of these soldiers, the war represented an experience of direct confrontation with imperialism, as they were recruited to fight in a European conflict that did not directly concern them. This experience contributed to the growth of nationalist movements in the colonies, which gained strength in the following decades. Colonial participation in the war, therefore, not only broadened the scope of the conflict, but also laid the foundations for the process of decolonization that intensified after the Second World War. The First World War also left a profound cultural and psychological legacy. Post-war literature, art, and film were marked by a bleak and disillusioned view of the conflict, reflecting the sense of futility and collective trauma. Works such as Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, and the poems of Wilfred Owen captured the horror and hopelessness experienced by soldiers. The war was seen as a turning point in the golden age of European optimism, destroying faith in the continued progress and civilizing capacities of humanity. Artistic movements such as Dadaism and Surrealism emerged in part as a response to the absurdity of war, rejecting the logic and order that seemed to have failed so catastrophically. The psychological impact of the conflict was also evident in the thousands of soldiers who returned with shell shock, a condition now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Society at the time was still ill-equipped to deal with the psychological consequences of the conflict, which contributed to a sense of alienation and loss that marked an entire generation. The question of whether the First World War was truly pointless depends on how we define the usefulness of a military conflict. If we consider the stated objectives of the powers, such as territorial expansion, political supremacy, or national security, it is clear that many of these objectives were not achieved in a sustainable manner. Germany failed to establish its hegemony in Europe and ended up being severely punished by the Treaty of Versailles. France, although it recovered Alsace-Lorraine, suffered enormous human and economic losses that left it weakened and vulnerable to the German threat in the 1930s. The United Kingdom retained its empire, but the cost of the war contributed to its decline as a global power in the following decades. Russia, for its part, underwent a revolution that completely changed its political structure, resulting in the creation of the Soviet Union. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, while Italy was dissatisfied with the territorial gains achieved. However, if we analyze the war from a broader historical perspective, we can consider that it had transformative, albeit unintended, consequences. World War I brought to the fore issues of national self-determination, changes in global power structures, and a new international order that attempted, albeit unsuccessfully, to prevent future conflicts on such a large scale. The creation of the League of Nations, for example, was an attempt to institutionalize diplomacy and prevent further world wars, although its ineffectiveness was demonstrated with the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The war also accelerated the process of female emancipation, as women played essential roles in the war effort, working in factories, hospitals, and even in military service. Ties of military support. This contributed to the advancement of women's rights, including the right to vote in several nations in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. In conclusion, the First World War can be seen as a tragedy in terms of loss of life and destruction, but also as a catalyst for significant changes that shaped the modern world. Its legacy is a mix of hard-learned lessons and unresolved problems, many of which still influence geopolitics and international relations in the 21st century. The perceived futility of the conflict, therefore, lies not only in its direct results, but in the inability of the powers to foresee and prevent the disastrous consequences of their actions, reinforcing the importance of diplomacy and international cooperation in a world that is increasingly interconnected and vulnerable to conflicts on a global scale.